Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Solutions and Climate Journalism webinar. We will get started in just a couple minutes. We'll wait for some more people to filter in. But while we wait for more participants to join, we do have some quiz questions for you up in the Zoom here. So the first question here, in 2019, what share of the world's population considered climate change a very serious threat or a somewhat serious threat to their country over the next 20 years? The answers here are A, around 25% of people, B, around 45% of people, or C, around 65% of people. So you can put your answer into the chat there of what you think. Is that on the proper screen now?
It is, yeah.
Okay. I was worried something else might be coming up. It was just a little weird. Oh,
yeah, no, that's the right one.
There
we go. There we go.
All right, so again, we have our question here. In 2019, what share of the world's population considered climate change a very serious threat or a somewhat serious threat to their country over the next 25 years? You can put your answers into the chat there. I see a pretty good mix of answers here. I see some A, B, and C. We'll give you another couple seconds to answer, and then we'll let you know which one the correct one is. All right, and the answer to this question is C. Around 65% of people consider climate change to be a very serious or somewhat serious threat in their country. But if you got this question wrong, you are not alone. 80% of people get this question wrong. Most people wrongly believe that the majority of people are not worried about climate change. We have one more question here before we get going. How much of the excess heat from global warming is captured in the ocean? A, 10%, B, 50%, or C, 90%? And again, you can put your answer in the chat there. I see a B, a C, a C. How much of the excess heat from global warming is captured in the ocean? I see another answer there for A. Another B. So again, we're pretty split on this question. And the answer again is C. Around 90% of the excess heat from global warming is captured in the ocean. But again, a lot of people get this question wrong. 90% of people get this question wrong, as most people are unaware that most global warming is hiding in the seas. If you think global warming is all about air temperature, you don't realize the size and the extent of the problem. All right, I think we are ready to get going here. Sarah, if you wanted to take it away.
Absolutely. So first off, I will introduce all of us. My name is Sarah. I work for JHR as a solutions journalism trainer. It's my colleague Kimberley, who also works for JHR as a solutions journalism trainer. And we have today as a guest Stefan Labbé, who is a climate and environment solutions reporter for Glacier Media. He's going to be here to answer some of your questions at the end as somebody who is doing this work in real time. And also we're going to look at an example of a story that he reported out later in the webinar. Stefan, if I can just ask you to turn off your camera for now, that way, and you'll turn it back on when you're answering questions, and we can get going. Thank you. So you signed up for a webinar and a training about how to do solutions journalism for climate stories. This is a super important and I think quite popular topic. And we're really happy to be teaching it. We're really happy to be part of doing this work. So your learning outcomes for today are going to be how to identify the key elements of a climate solutions journalism story. For those of you who have already done some solutions journalism training, you will recognize the 4 pillars. For those of you who haven't, this is a good way to sort of think through what the pillars are in a very specific topic, so climate change for this time. We're going to look at the types of climate solutions or climate solutions journalism, different ways of approaching stories. We're going to look at how climate solutions journalism can strengthen audience growth and engagement and why you want to do it, like why bother for your audience. And we're going to look a little bit at how to develop and report on stories using a climate solutions journalism approach. So the definition of solutions journalism is that it is rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So climate change is obviously a pretty big social problem that we are all facing, though we're all affected differently. And so solutions journalism is a great way of writing about and producing stories on climate change. So we're going to do a review of the 4 pillars. Like I said, for those of you who have already done some solutions journalism, this will be familiar. So solutions journalism features not just a person, but a response to the problem and how it happened. So it has to be describing and reporting on a response to a social issue that is defined. That means a response that is happening either in real time or has happened. It's not a plan to do a thing. It's not the announcement of a new idea that hasn't been tested yet. It's something is happening, a response is happening, and we're reporting on it. Secondly, the second pillar is that the story provides available evidence of results, looking at effectiveness and not just at intention. So that gets to that point about things have to either be happening now or have happened in the past. So the story has to seek to provide insight that can help others respond as well. And like if they want to replicate or version that response into their own context, not just inspiration. And the last one, and this is really where it differentiates itself, like solutions journalism differentiates itself from advocacy, in that it talks really honestly and candidly and rigorously about the limitations of the response. No response is going to be able to hit everybody in every place for every issue. That's just not possible. So looking at sort of the boundaries of the response and how it's working for different people in different areas and how it's not working is super important. So a way that you can remember a little acronym that they have for what solutions journalism should be is to remember that you want to be telling the whole story. So the W is what response does it address? This is really important. The H is how it works, or the how done it. The O is that it offers insight. The L is that it includes limitations. Like I said, this is what differentiates it from advocacy. And the E is that most importantly, it provides evidence of the impact of the response.
And for anyone who isn't completely familiar with the 4 pillars of solutions journalism, we have also run a training on the basics of solutions journalism, which you can find on our YouTube page for JHR, and which we will send out in follow-up resources following this presentation. But now we are going to move on to the different types of climate solutions journalism that you can write. So first of all, what is climate change? Well, by now we're all pretty familiar with it, I think, but we know that the planet is warming according to broad scientific consensus. And that means that a lot of really bad things are happening around the world. We have greater heat waves, melting glaciers, and with it sea level rise, increasing intense wildfires, dying reefs due to bleaching and ocean acidification. The impacts are making food harder to grow, displacing human communities and destroying wildlife habitats, contaminating water sources and raising the threat of pests and disease. So a lot of really negative things are happening due to climate change. But there are a lot of people and a lot of groups out there who are coming up with a lot of solutions to this problem. And so now we'll talk about a couple ways that you can frame these stories to cover these solutions. So the first one we have here is mitigation. So stories about mitigation, such as tree planting and forest preservation, and also switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy or carbon capture schemes. So here we have an example of a story that revolves around mitigation of climate change impacts. This story here comes from the discourse, and it talks about Indigenous practices and how they are the future and past of wildfire prevention. All across the globe, we've seen a real scary increase in wildfires, and this has happened here in Canada too. For nearly 6 months in 2021, the Mount Law wildfire near West Kelowna scorched 976 hectares of land. It ignited approximately 2 kilometers away from the municipality on August 15th, and the wildfire burned for over 19 days before crews contained the spread on September 3rd. But miraculously, when the smoke cleared, Central Okanagan Emergency Operations reported the fire inflicted significant damage to only one structure. Favorable weather and dedicated firefighters managed to control the blaze. But the groundwork for keeping the area relatively unscathed was laid by West Bank First Nation years before the first tree caught flame. Hand treatment mitigation work, informed by traditional practices, conducted between 2015 and 2016 in the area of the West Bank First Nation Community Forest, ultimately slowed the Mount Law's wildfire spread and reduced its intensity. So this article here just goes all into the practice and how it can be beneficial in reducing the severity and intensity of wildfires. And by reading this article, you could find out if that could be something, a solution that could work in your region as well. So next here we have stories about adaptation. So those can be things like building coastal defenses to protect communities from rising seas, switching to drought or flood resistant seeds and crops, and other such things. So we have an example here. This one actually comes from Stefan as well. So if you have any questions about that, you can save them until the end. So this story here is concerned about flooding. Again, with climate change, we're seeing rising seas and increased rainfall. So many cities are facing the issue of flooding, and Vancouver in Canada is among those cities. And Vancouver is using green infrastructure to keep the worst effects at bay. The idea here is to simulate a natural water cycle that has been wiped out from decades of city building. Besides the aesthetic benefits of more green space, positive spin-offs include mitigation of flood levels, cleaning tainted rainwater for aquatic species, and a general urban cooling effect that regulates temperatures at the height of the summer. So this article here looks at how effective the practice can be, and also what Vancouver can learn from a US city to the south that has also been implementing these practices, which is Seattle. And finally, we have here stories about resilience. So those are stories that focus on solutions that help people or even animals cope with climate change, as both human and animals and wildlife and nature in general are being deeply impacted by climate change. So this story here comes from the Narwhal, and it focuses on the Vancouver Island marmot, which is Canada's most endangered mammal, and is found in the wild on Vancouver Island mountains. Following clear-cut logging, road building, and other human disturbances, predators like cougars were given easy access to marmot colonies. Only 27 Vancouver Island marmots were left in Canada's wild. Following intensive recovery efforts, the wild population has increased 8-fold to just over 200 animals. So this story here looks at how this animal was able to be brought back from the brink. Next here we have another article from Stefan. This one comes from Glacier Media, where all of his articles live. And it focuses on a heat wave that decimated Vancouver. Following this heat wave, almost 600 people lost their lives. So Stefan investigated how the city could prepare for another heat wave and what could be done to keep people safe during these types of heat waves, especially those in low-income areas where deaths were higher. In the weeks following the heat dome, climate scientists found that that heat wave was made 150 times more likely due to human-caused climate change. By the 2040s, such events could occur every 5 to 10 years. And this is a problem that cities and regions around the world will be facing as temperatures continue to rise. So in the next couple slides here, I'm going to go over how Stefan was able to write this piece and the challenges that he encountered in doing so. So Stefan's reporting on the heat dome started as a breaking news story about the near collapse of emergency services and a rising death toll. His reporting involved to include explainers on the stages of heat death, how wildlife was impacted, birds, ocean life, farm animals, etc., and an early response from municipal and provincial authorities. Once people stopped dying, the biggest questions left to answer were, who was hit hardest and why? Hints that some neighborhoods were hit harder than others started to emerge when Vancouver City Council passed a motion to protect the most vulnerable from heat waves, which you can see in the last article on the slide here. Not long after, Stefan convinced a medical health officer to share an unreleased map showing emergency room visits due to heat illness during the heat wave, and it was broken down by postal code. Off the record at first, it still allowed him to focus his reporting on the hardest hit areas. When he compared emergency room visits next to satellite temperature data and tree canopy coverage, the pattern was undeniable. Temperatures soared in the poorest neighborhoods with the fewest trees. He contacted every municipality in the region, asking them how their tree canopy was either growing or shrinking. Despite the inequalities within the city, Vancouver was one of the only ones that didn't show an overall decline. Reporting the solution hinged on the questions, how did Vancouver achieve relative success? How was it still failing? And what was missing to close the green divide between neighborhoods? And so here we can see the maps and the ER visits due to heat illnesses. And as we can see here, the increase in temperature correlates to a lack of tree cover. We can see especially that here highlighted in the downtown east side area of Vancouver. So what were some of the challenges that Stefan faced while reporting this story? Well, number one was accessing data. The city of Vancouver refused to share data he needed to map the problem. So he turned to a GIS consultant who had worked with the cities previously. They helped him pull satellite data, make sense of the temperature and tree canopy maps you see in the story. Outside of age, health officials and the coroner's office hadn't released anything to explain who was most vulnerable to heat death. So Stefan started working contacts at the local health authority, trying to get a hint of any unreleased data. The next biggest challenge was finding sources. Who survived the hottest parts of the city with the fewest trees? And so he did a couple things to find these types of information. He joined neighborhood Facebook groups. He visited safe injection sites and homeless encampments in the neighborhoods with the most emergency room visits. He walked streets and parks during the later heat waves, and he interviewed the city's chief arborist and rode along with staff trying to save trees. Another challenge that presented itself was visuals. Aside from maps, Stefan wanted to show the difference in tree canopies of two neighborhoods, one flush with trees and the other starved. First, he considered a drone, but licensing was delayed, so he settled on streetscapes to show this difference. To capture people in the heat, Stefan went out with city arborists, keeping trees alive during the city's second hottest summer ever. He visited park encampments during a second heat wave and a third heat wave, and he stalked out misting stations. So how can you go about finding these types of climate stories to report on? Well, there are lots of different ways that you can go about doing this. And the first one is studies and reports. So first you need to recognize that you can't cover everything. Stefan has mentioned that he tries to focus on stories that have a local angle and are novel and offer a solution to a systemic problem. For example, a researcher who created wolf moguls to prevent them from overhunting caribou in northern BC. It's important to always keep in mind what's going to be the most important to your audience and try to cover those types of stories. Next, you can go to the government. Municipal and regional governments tend to produce the most consistent stories and leads. Stefan keeps an eye out for interesting solutions to local problems. For example, how a city is using green infrastructure to prevent flooding and clean water for salmon. And we mentioned this story before in the adaptation section. Next, you can look at courts. So Stefan has automated decision notifications set up through Canly and regularly browses decisions. He also cultivates tips from legal sources working on the environment and climate change, like West Coast Environmental or the Environmental Law Center. So you could look for those types of resources in your city as well and see if they lead to any possible stories. Next, talk to the experts, whether scientists, Indigenous elders, or someone who just knows something well. Always ask at the end of an interview, are there any climate solutions out there that have caught your eye recently? And another tip is to read widely and bounce ideas off of colleagues. You can keep a running list of story leads, ideas, and evergreen explainers. Stefan tries to regularly think through different beats, whether housing, energy, health, or immigration, because every beat has a climate story, and what he could add to that coverage through a climate lens. Overarching everything is the question, who has been through this before? And of course, there are many challenges that you will encounter when you are going to write about climate. One of the biggest challenges, how do you decide what to cover? There's so many stories out there. Almost everything can be a climate change story, but that doesn't mean you have to cover everything. Stefan tries to report what others are missing and what interests him personally, while keeping people at the center of the story whenever possible. It's also important to remember that not everything is going to turn into a solution story, and that can be perfectly fine. Turn it into a straight news story or a narrative feature, and maybe you can try again next time or come back to this story again in the future and then take a solutions angle. It's also important to remember that not every story has to be a massive investigation or feature. These stories can be turned around in a day. For example, in June, Stefan reported a long feature about Indigenous wildfire practices. It didn't tick all the pillars, but he published it anyway. Then a researcher contacted him with a tip. When it comes to Indigenous cultural burning, Australia was a couple decades ahead of BC. About 24 hours later, he turned around another story, this time with a solutions angle. And he asked, could Australia's success with Indigenous burning solve BC's wildfire problem? So although there are many challenges, of course, there are many solutions to covering climate in the news.
I'm going to talk about why you might want to use climate solutions journalism as opposed to just covering climate problems and climate issues for the benefit of both your newsroom and your audience. I will first apologize. In like the last 5 minutes, construction seems to have started very close to my door. So if you are hearing noises, I'm very sorry. I can't do anything about it. I'm hoping that my headphone sort of sorts some of that out, but I'm aware and I'm sorry. So why use solutions journalism when covering climate stories? So one of the big reasons to use solutions journalism is about informing people in a way that empowers them about solutions. So we know from this Pew Research study in 2021 that 72% of people in 17 countries are very or somewhat concerned that climate change will affect them personally at some point in the future. I think that one of the narratives that we have contributed to, been fed, all been swimming in for the last number of decades is that people don't care, is that people don't want to think about it and they don't care and they just want to keep on living their lives. So the research says different. The research says that 72% of people in 17 countries are in fact quite worried. On the flip side, so like I was saying about empowering people instead of just scaring them, 79% of headlines on the 25 most linked to news sites evoked fear, hopelessness, and or a feeling of being overwhelmed. Only 10% had neutral headline, and 6% evoked hope, and 5% alluded to a solution. So 5% of all headlines alluding to a solution or response and the agency involved in climate change, that there is, action possible. So this is following the IPCC report in August and the analysis by AS. So what we found and what studies have found is that news coverage is deactivating readers when a time when communities need to take action. This can lead to a paralyzing effect on our audiences, and instead of being activated by fear, they bury their heads in the sand in response to the deeply frightening climate change messages that media routinely amplifies. And this also goes for reporters too, right? Like, we are probably some of the most prolific news consumers, and we have more agency in that we are writing the stories too, but we still also exist in that climate, and it can be really, really difficult. So climate change may be the hot topic at the moment, but it's also one that leaves audiences prone to burnout. Is the media to blame? Partially. So rather than telling stories about the impacts of changing climate that strike fear and paralysis in readers, how can we highlight the ways in which people around the world are responding to these problems? And according to a Smith-Geiger market research done in 2020, the percentage of people who trusted the story when it was a story about a problem was about 55%. And when it was a story about a solution or a response, it was about 83%. So people are hungry for this. People want to consume this kind of news. And I'm sorry for keeping using the word empowered. It's not my favorite, but I think it fits here. Solutions journalism stories are empowering to people. So journalism's theory of change, according to journalists, like the way that we've practiced news, the way that we've done news traditionally, and in the Western world at least, is that journalists act as whistleblowers and expose wrongdoing. Like, if we point to a problem, that alone will spur change and movement in sort of the powers that be, and also just the general public. How's that working out for us? Certainly in my career and with the journalists that I know, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes that works and often it doesn't. And I'm sure that many of you in your newsrooms, or if you're, a news consumer, you feel like there's just a lot of reporting on the same thing. We're reporting the problems over and over and over again, and it feels like stuff isn't necessarily changing. So for what solutions journalism's answer to that is that journalists expose wrongdoing and take away the excuses to not change by showing that better is possible, by showing that it is, like, some neighborhoods can have more trees and that lowers the temperature. That's a very real world thing to point to that will hugely impact people's lives, like literally in this case, lives. Pointing out social problems and models for solving them will spur more reform than just pointing out the problem. And Kim, if you want to play this little video. Oh, we can't hear it.
So solutions journalism to me means taking a different approach to journalism.
Solutions journalism is actually completing the job of reporting.
Solutions journalism is about balance, not just looking at the problem, but also exploring ways to solve the problem.
And we're trying to help our town or our county or our city or our state progress to a better place.
It's a critical part of how we resolve a crisis.
Traditional media has been really great at reporting what the problems are. Solutions journalism is a way of looking at the other side of the story.
We need to deeply dig in, find out what's working, how it's working, and why.
Solutions journalism is a way to take away the excuses of people who are doing a bad job.
It's easy to forget that people are solving those problems.
Solutions journalism offers a lens into new possibilities.
It's very forward-looking. It's a new kind of product.
It's going out and reporting a story and then kind of taking that additional step and looking at the bigger impact of that.
Society solving problems. That's useful for our audience. It's useful for other people in the field.
Just empowering them, just letting them know there is a solution.
If no one is talking about the solutions, they won't bother to emulate them.
It's about going beyond demolition do construction.
Solutions journalism gives audiences a way to look into the future and imagine new possibilities.
Solutions journalism is what we should have been doing all along.
Solutions.
Okay, so next we are going to go over how exactly you can start doing climate solutions journalism. So there are lots of ways to use data in your climate reporting, and there's lots of different slices that you can use to lead your stories. So what we've done here is we've broken out data slices that you can look at and examples of how that can turn into a solution story. So for example, you could do a comparison to peers. Which cities or countries have an effective response to the same problem that you are facing, and how have they been able to implement that solution? We saw a little bit of this type of story earlier with Vancouver looking at what Seattle had done in regards to green infrastructure and how effective it had been in their city. You can also look at change over time. So which cities, provinces, countries, etc., have improved on their own records over time, and how were they able to go from failure to success? You can also look by by method or by best practice. Who's had interesting results in implementing a solution? You can also look by subgroup. So which communities have most improved their infrastructure linked to a solution? You can also look by cost, because cost can be something very prohibitive when you're trying to implement climate solutions. So who's been able to reduce a price as a solution or as part of a solution? You can also look by coverage, because as we saw from that Vancouver heatwave article, even within cities, things are not all equal. Certain areas of a city will have more tree coverage than others, for example. So which city, province, or council has had success with specific policies? Who has been able to improve their coverage? You could also look by disparity. Again, not everyone is feeling climate change equally. It tends to be very unevenly distributed, with marginalized groups bearing the brunt of the negative impacts of climate change. So who's been able to reduce inequality in marginalized communities? These are all sets of data that you can look at and investigate to lead your solutions reporting in regards to climate. So how exactly can you go about finding those stories though, before you break them out into your data sets? Many people who want to do solutions journalism aren't always sure where to begin. This is partly because as journalists, we've been trained over and over and over again to spot problems. It isn't challenging to find examples of widespread problems, but it can take work to find places that are effectively responding to those problems. Of course, this doesn't mean that solutions don't exist. We just need to reorient how we see the world to be more mindful of compelling solutions. So where can you go to find possible solutions? Well, we have a couple ideas for you up here on the slides, and this isn't exhaustive, but it's just some that we know that journalists have turned to. So you could turn to think tanks or policy experts. You can always look at large data sets, people involved in the implementation of a solution, networks of innovators, program officers in foundations, or people involved in the problem on the ground. Another really great resource that you can use here is the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker. So they have, I think it's over 16,000 now, vetted solution stories. So if a story is in the tracker, you know a real live person has read it and they have determined that this story meets all four solutions pillars. And you can search by many different areas, including solution location, a journalist, success factor. And you can specifically Google or search here climate change. They also have a collection on their story tracker that's just climate solutions. So if you're looking for some inspiration, you can go and read the types of journalism that other writers have produced. Another thing we suggest for journalists to do is to work backwards from data outcomes. And you do that by exploring positive deviance or slices of a data set that get at the best performer. Often when journalists look at data, they're looking for who's doing the worst. What city is the most violent? What country has seen the most percentage of their coastline disappear? But you can flip it and you can ask the opposite. For example, what Canadian city has the best air quality? What country has managed to increase their tree cover the most? And you can see who's doing the best. A positive deviant is a signal that something newsworthy could be happening. It's the journalist's job to get the story behind the positive deviant, and in so doing, uncover information that could be valuable for people everywhere. And by working backwards from these data outcomes, that really dispels any notion that solutions journalism could be PR. And some journalists are hesitant to attempt solutions journalism because they fear being labeled advocates or PR representatives. But with positive deviant journalism, the data will be guiding your story, and that will refute any confusion with advocacy. The next thing you'll need to do in your reporting is start building your reporting by asking who is doing it better. That's kind of the fundamental question at the center of all solutions journalism. But there are some other questions that you can ask to make sure that your story is going to hit all of those pillars that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. So again, a non-exhaustive list, but we've put up some questions that we think would be very useful in helping to guide your reporting. So some of those questions include, is the solution scalable and can it apply somewhere else? With what effect? Really getting at that insights pillar. What are the barriers to its replication? What evidence is there to show that the solution is working? In what ways is it not, and how do we know? So this question here would both get at evidence of the effectiveness of the solution and limitations, because no solution is going to be a silver bullet, especially to a problem as wide and as complex as climate change. What are the shortcomings of this response? Where did this idea come from? And finally, it's important that you know your audience. What is it that they are specifically concerned about? What do they already know? Is climate change a divisive issue? And if so, how can you talk about it without alienating people? Because as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, we don't want to be turning people away or deactivating them with this climate solutions coverage. We want to be empowering them and having them lean more into the news.
So that brings us to more examples of how you would actually go about doing that. So one of the things that we talk a lot about, Kim and I, is doing climate solutions on every beat. You don't have to be Stefan, whose job it is to find climate solutions, to be doing these stories. So we have examples of how to get at some of these issues on every single beat. Surprisingly, a lot of them are business, or maybe unsurprisingly, I don't know, I was surprised by that, but there's a lot of business stories that are concerned with climate. There's a lot of potential stories out there. So the example that we have here is the business of burps from the New York Times. So basically it's investigating a solution or response that sees whether an altered diet can change how much methane cows produce. Because we know that methane and methane gases are a problem for the environment. On a sports beat, you can look at how sports teams, how different organizations are responding to climate challenges. The example here is from Huffington Post. And it's that a UK team, a UK soccer or football, I'm sorry, I'm very North American, team was the first ever to be certified as carbon neutral by the UN. So they changed their stadium, they changed some of the way that they operate. And so now they're certified carbon neutral. You can do it on the arts and culture beat. Here we have an example from the Sierra Club, where a conservation organization run by a fashion executive donated a huge amount of land for parks for the Chilean government. You can look at it, technology. I mean, we talk about green tech all the time, so technology is a great place to look for those solutions. Again, you want to avoid the hype machine. You want to not be doing PR, so make sure that you're talking about those limitations, make sure that you're talking to the communities or the individuals affected by those technologies and by those proposed solutions. So here, we have a story from The World, and it's about an app that helps Inuit adapt to changing climate. And this one I thought was really cool. So hunters will take photos using this app of ice. And then it'll help with real-time monitoring, but also see, patterns and trends in ice thickness, which is really, really, really important to Inuit life. You can do it in education. So here we have an example. I don't know where this is from. Oh, from Arizona, about how high school students banded together and like they were a track team. They noticed that they were running and training in air quality, like in, the air quality that they were in was quite poor. And they pushed their school and their school district to get electric buses. And the school district did that. And then the last one is health. I think right now, like we're living in a time of reporting more heavily on health stories. And it's really important to consider like sort of the bigger picture for health. It's not just sort of the responsive and reactive end. It's, how can we be preventing health problems and health issues that people are having. So this is an example from Kitimat, BC, where basically aluminum smelting had affected the air quality of this community for decades. And the emissions that were being produced have been linked to respiratory illness. And a group of concerned citizens pushed for more oversight and they won. So, there's always a way to get at climate, sort of no matter what you're covering. Again, what Kim was saying, the questions that every solutions reporter should be asking themselves and asking their sources are, who is doing it better? And asking themselves, is there a possible solutions angle to the story? There may not be. Not every single story is going to be a solutions story, but I think that if we are spending more time thinking about whether or not it's possible, we're going to say yes more often. So that is our presentation. We are open for questions. Stefan is open for questions. If you have any specific to him or just about the process of actually doing solutions journalism, he is, an expert in the room. As are, I think I was just sort of watching the chat a little bit, and as are some of you. So yeah, just really, really excited to hear what you have to say. Kim, do we have any in the Q&A?
Nothing in there yet. We do have a question here. I'm a freelance journalist. Are there any news organizations that are open to solutions journalism on climate change topics? I can actually try and find a list of news organizations that are open to they're just open to solutions pitches in general, but that should mean that they are open to climate solutions pitches as well. But that's something that you can find on the Solutions Journalism Network website. They have lots of great resources for freelancers. But while some other questions come in, I'll try to find that link for you if I can remember where it is on the website.
I can say very anecdotally that in the work that Kim and I are doing at JHR, which does involve, sort of liaising with publications, particularly in Canada, they are hungry for this. They want this. They want solution stories and they want to do better at climate reporting. I think that there's a general understanding, and Stefan, I hope you can speak to this as well. I think there's a general understanding that we need to be doing more of it, and also that we need to be doing it differently. And this is an option for how to do that.
Yeah, I mean,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's definitely an area that I see our audience reacting to. Small, medium, big reporting projects, all of them, and also for colleagues and not just in climate change, people coming and being like, hey, how do I do this work? And I point them to you guys, the Solutions Journalism Network, or I walk them through a story. It's looking at it at a different angle and asking some very simple questions, and maybe it becomes a solution story. Sometimes it's just not set up for that. But one of the things I find really helpful is just having a beat area, because you start building that expertise, and then from there, the stories just kind of snowball.
Definitely. We have a question for you, Stefan. Kelly asks, I'm wondering if you had to convince your editor to pursue solutions journalism stories or whether there was already an interest in solutions journalism. And if you had to do any convincing of anybody, how did you do that?
Is she on this call? It was a bit of an interesting process. So I pitched a climate reporter position to my publication. So I worked at a local publication. We have a chain of newspapers in British Columbia and to the prairies of Canada, so Western Canada, let's say. And I pitched a job for myself, working at a central desk that does kind of work that gets syndicated across our entire chain of newspapers. And she came back with, that sounds great, but how about a solutions role? So you can be, really focused on that. And I was like, oh, okay. And I knew a little bit about solutions journalism, but I had never really pursued it. So to be fair, I've only been at this for about a year. And I'm still learning as I go from people that really have been doing this for much longer. But it's been a crazy year here in British Columbia. We've had the hottest weather on record and in Canadian history, recorded history, let's say, devastating floods. So it's been a year where climate has been really forefront in the news and people's lives. And so there's no convincing, I think, any publication needs to do now in this part of Canada, at least, to say that, look, this is an important role in your newsroom. And I see this echoed across nationally and then in publications in the US, Europe. These jobs are popping up more and more. And if you can just, lay out this argument that we're hearing now, and it's an argument that also gets a lot of eyeballs, if that's all your publication's worried about. I think it's just a simple calculation. They're important stories and people want them.
Yep, I will say, as an editor, I just want good stories. Like, I want good journalism, and solutions journalism provides a really solid framework for doing that. So that's, encourage you to pitch that. And you might have to do a little bit of education. If your editor doesn't know what solutions journalism is, you might have to explain it to them and maybe share some presentations that we do. But I think that people are eager to be on side.
Yeah, and I also like to say that I was a bit skeptical at first because I did come at this from the perspective of someone who does more accountability work. And I think we were in a call a little while ago with someone out of Connecticut, I think a former investigative journalist. He put it really well. He said that, like, you don't have to sacrifice accountability journalism to do solutions work. You can find that place who's doing it better. And then you find that place right next to it that's doing it worse. And when you put those side by side and you show that data, you hold it that institution, that organization right next door who's doing it bad to account, right? You show them, look, why aren't you doing it like this? Look, your neighbor right here is doing a great job. So yeah, you're just taking that next step in your accountability reporting. So I've come to realize that, and it's, I think, enriched the work I do, or at least I try to make it go that way.
We have a question here in the Q&A from Carolina. Stefan, what is the biggest challenge you have when trying to find evidence about climate solutions?
That's a great question. I think, okay, so I'll say this, start with the business area, because that's something that came to my mind as we were talking about beat areas. There's a lot of big claims that get made by companies around climate change and technology that purports to fix some problem. Because there's a lot of money that's getting, more and more money getting poured into this investment. People come up with these great grand ideas and they're not always proven. And so you can't, and sometimes they're also not, they haven't been implemented, so you can't show that evidence yet, right? That's hard. Data, I like to start with data, so I try to start with big databases, find that positive deviance, and then figure out places that are doing it better. So sometimes it'll just be a little bit better. So for example, I'm looking at vehicle population data right now at a municipal level and figuring out which municipalities have reduced vehicle traffic the most, and then who at the same time has improved EV uptake by municipality, and then letting that guide my reporting to the best performers. But you got to start there because you need that data because so many people, politicians, businesses make big claims, right? So yeah, I just let data guide me. It's hard to find sometimes, but yeah, work sources, you talk to them, ask them at the end of every interview, hey, is there any good data sets you think I should look for? Can you share that data with me? Or sometimes it's not public, and yeah, they'll hand it over. They'll hand a bit of it over enough to give you a clue where to direct your reporting. So yeah, I mean, it depends on what context we're talking about. In Canada, I could give you some examples, but I know a lot of people are calling in from other places.
I think it's also worth saying, there's a lot of solution stories out there that don't have like data sets or numbers associated with them with a lot of the time. I know in Canada we have a real dearth of that kind of information. Going to the communities for whom the response is proposed is, I think, a really good way of getting that information. And that's valid too. Like, so the story that we talked about a little bit for the technology beat, where with the Inuit using the app, like they would be the ones to know whether it's good or not. They are those people. So that's also a valid thing.
And we have another question here. Can we talk a little bit more about limitations? I have a possible solution story about a new renewable energy facility, and part of me struggles with hoping it doesn't end up like a puff piece. So how can reporters really report and relay the information about limitations of these types of solutions?
Is that to me?
I think it's to anyone.
Do you want to go?
Sure. Maybe. Okay. So sorry, it's a renewable energy facility, and you're doing like initial reporting on it. I guess I need to know more. Like, has it been built yet? Do we know how much energy is being produced? Is it living up to its promises? How much energy is it going to produce? Will that amount of energy, how much will that provide the community that you're trying to target? How much emissions are being offset with that? I mean, you can look into who's funding it too, right? Like you could do a series where you can look at where the money's coming from. Has this worked somewhere else? Where have these projects been done before? Yeah, I'd need to know a little bit more about the project, I guess, before you really start digging into it. But I mean, really, you can even just ask in the interview, what are the limitations of this? Half the time, if it's an informed bureaucrat or a researcher or someone that's on the technical side, they'll tell you, right? If it's someone on the political side, they probably won't, or they'll spin it somehow.
And then we have a question here. Please, can you give more explanation about the insight pillar on Sojo? And this is a pillar that can be a little bit slippery to nail down, this insight pillar. What I ask myself when I'm reading a solutions journalism story to see if it hits this pillar is I ask myself, if other cities or other municipalities wanted to implement a similar program, what types of insights could they glean from this story? What could they learn from it? But I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions of how to find that insight pillar.
Kim and you and I, we've recently been talking about this and how to explain it, like how to teach it. This is our job. And we often find that it's attached to one of the other pillars. So explaining how a solution has played out, explaining how proponents have gone about implementing something can be insight. Explaining the evidence and what the real world effects have been of the program or solution can be insight. And limitations is often a really good one, because when somebody discusses a limitation, you can ask them if they've solved for it. Like, you can ask them how they address that limitation or how they want to, and that can also be an example of insight.
Yeah, I think it's also like insight can be really simple too. It can just be that thing that the reader walks away with. I did a story about a jetty that was built 100 years ago for navigation in BC's biggest river. It's the province I'm in Canada, and it's acted as a barrier to salmon habitat for all that time. And a group of people came together and they carved a 30-meter gap in the jetty. And after a few weeks, they counted thousands and thousands of salmon going through. And it was a success. There was evidence there. And for me, the insight was these things can work for everyone without changing humans' lives. Like it absolutely affected no one else, and it benefited the salmon. So I mean, it was just that's one of a few insights that the story came away with. But I think that's something that like a reader can walk away with, be like, look, we can have a win-win-win here.
And we had some participants chiming in the chat. Michelle here says, insights are the heart of the work, but it is hard to know what it will be before going out to do the work. It is about lessons learned, but often it includes things that came out as the people tried to make a solution better. We do have another question here. This kind of relates to the impact of solutions journalism reporting. How do you get governments to act on a particular issue that is lingering for years? And I think this is a problem that a lot of places face, and that journalists will cover a certain issue from a problem perspective over and over and over again. And if you've written about that problem extensively and nothing has happened, maybe it's time to take a different approach. Maybe then it's time to take a solutions journalism approach to show that better is indeed possible. And often better is actually happening just down the road. So as Stefan mentioned, it is another way to hold governments or whatever it is that you're dealing with accountable. However, that doesn't mean it's always going to have that impact that you want. Unfortunately, a lot of it is out of the journalist's hands. And so, you do the best that you can covering these issues, but sometimes you will get that impact that you are looking for, and other times it might evade you for a while.
And also, there's something to be said about repetition. Like if we have been writing the story about the problem every other week for 20 years, it's not one solution story that's necessarily going to turn that on its head and change everything, right? So you can keep reporting, you can do update stories, you can do follows on solutions, and that hopefully will become a greater part of the conversation and build to a critical mass as well.
And I see one more question here, that some governments and their supporters deny the environment-related crisis. How can we journalists demystify this retrograde ideology? So for those people who still don't believe that the climate crisis is real, what can journalists do?
Stefan, any ideas?
Yeah, I would say report on the science and report on people doing work that don't even bother. I mean, a lot of the times I think our audiences, and this is going to change for everyone on this call because we're all from different places, but I think you'd be surprised how many people, even in some of the most politicized parts of the United States, for example, that, are hungry for stories that don't even put that question whether climate change is real on the table. So write for the people that accept that as established or at least consensus science, and then go from there, because I think we're at that point, at least as a global audience. It's going to change, I know, from place to place, but yeah, work with the evidence. that's where we're reporters, right? That's what we do.
I think there's also something to be said about often solutions journal, like, so it's difficult for readers to conceive of like big abstract things. So numbers, even like 1, 1.5, 2, like what does that mean? I think that solutions journalism is a really good tool to show how, so like what the problem is in their local area, in their region, that is impacting them, their families, their loved ones, and the people who are like, it's opening a door for them to see how it's impacting them, and also giving them that agency. You know, we talked about how people are, you know, turned off or deactivated by, you know, only negative, overwhelming negative coverage. And I don't know, like, you know, I haven't spoken to every climate change denier in the world, but I imagine that that's an element of it. You know, they don't want to hear it, they don't want to deal with it. The solutions journalism can open a door to sort of bringing in more audiences for that.
I think it's also really important if this is your beat, or if it isn't, to include a lot of explanatory work peppered in there, because sometimes, actually, I would say too much of the time, reporting on climate solutions or otherwise is very academic, and we use words that we expect people to know because we're in it and we hear it and we understand it at a deeper level, perhaps. And we say things like mitigation and adaptation without even like just assuming the reader understands what we're talking about. So sometimes just a simple explainer, like, here are these climate change buzzwords, like what do they actually mean? And just like break it down a bit and get away from jargon, you know, try to make it just like a story that is accessible to everyone, you know, and that goes back to, like, for me, trying to put people at the center of stories, because that's how we as human beings relate, right?
Well, I think that we have gone through all the questions here, so we just have a couple slides to get through until we are finished. So first here, we do have a survey, and I'm going to drop that. We've dropped it twice into the chats because we really want you to fill it out. We are always looking to improve our programming and to add new things from our programming. And we need to hear from you to know what you want so that we can respond to those wants and needs. So you can click on that link there. The survey only takes 2 or 3 minutes to fill out. It should be very quick, and we really appreciate your responses. Next, we have just some resources that can help you as you start climate solutions reporting or solutions reporting in general. So the first one here comes from the Solutions Journalism Network. And all of the resources on their website are free and they're very valuable. And the one that we have thrown up here is the Learning Lab. And what the Learning Lab holds is different guides to solutions reporting. So they have solutions reporting 101, but they also have for some various other beats and topics like health, education, and violence. Here we have some additional links. I would highly suggest that you sign up for the Journalists for Human Rights Solutions Journalism newsletter. I'm very biased because I make it, but I think it's great. And there's
We're really proud of it. It's really nice, guys.
And we won't plug out your inbox. We send one every couple months, and we try to just distill the most valuable information that we've learned during those months and share it with you. You can also find JHR's past solutions webinars in our YouTube playlist. We have Solutions Journalism, the basics, reporting on solutions journalism in small newsrooms. We have a panelist discussion about the climate crisis, which is really wonderful, and I think will really help add on to this conversation that we've had today. And we have also hosted a panel on solutions visual reporting as well. As mentioned previously, you can sign up for the Solutions Journalism Network. It's free and there's all types of resources on there as well. And they have a couple different newsletters offered as well. Other than that, we would like to thank you very much for attending today. If you do have any questions or if you have any thing that you wanted to follow up with us about, mine and Sarah's emails are up on the page there, and all of these resources will be sent out in a follow-up email, so you will get all of these resources for you to keep. And we also want to give a really big thanks to Stefan for joining us today and for letting us use his work for a big chunk of this presentation because it's great. And so we really appreciate him coming in and answering all of your questions today. But with that, I think we wish everyone to have a great rest of the day, and we thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much, everybody.